whenever you're ready, Kay.
Okay, I'm set. You may definitely take over.
Is the class all here?
Yes, the class is here.
Don't they have anything better to do? No, anyway, sorry.
Not with you speaking, heavens no.
Shocking lack of standards. Let me just hide myself somewhat. Before we start, I do feel the need to say, is everybody doing all right in the class? I mean, I hope no one's COVID positive and no one has people they're caring for that are.
Not that we know of.
Oh, good.
We've had a horse wreck. Poor Jana fell off her horse when a dog ran under him. But other than that, I think we're all well.
Good. So I have to figure out what I'm sharing. 1 second. I guess I
know Zoom is still challenging. I have to admit, it's takes some practice.
Okay, now I know what I'm doing. I'm sorry. All right, so I'll take over screen share.
All right.
Now can you see it?
Yes, we're viewing your screen.
Great. Great. So before we start, I just wanted to touch base on Gelati is jackhammering up next to Susan and me. So if every now and then you see me jump up and close a window or something, it's because they're outside. This class is materially different than the vegetable class. And I want to kind of give you all a way to change how you think about this. Master gardeners were often operating in a seasonal window or a multi-year window for a plant, sometimes longer. But when you're dealing with trees, it's 50 to 100 years or more. So as a gardener, you're more of a steward of a portion of a tree's life, but not the whole life, because it will be there after we shuffle off. So in times like that, I have found that this is a different consciousness than my regular gardening. And so taking more time, doing more research, thinking more is actually a good thing, because you're always going to be in this position of thinking just the litany of right plant, right place. Then you have to say over time. And so as we go into citrus tree gardening, I just want to give you all an opportunity to take a big step back, take a deep breath, and think about something that probably can live between 50 and 100 years, and in other parts of the world, 100 or more. And so our window of involvement with this tree is, even if you're planting it and you stayed in the same house and you lived there for 30 years, that's a third of the life of the tree. With that in mind, so you know about me. Anyway, so the objectives of the class is, since we haven't taught this to the trainee classes before, you're sort of the guinea pigs. So the objectives of the Master Gardener Handbook is to make you aware of varieties that do well in Marin, and then I need to caveat that. I'll come back to that. Understand the basic cultural requirements. Get some basic pest and disease management background. By the way, that's one area that can be infinitely deep. So I'm being superficial. You can go deeper and deeper in that area. Tree selection, planting, and care for young trees versus care and problem solving for mature trees. So this is sort of what we're trying to do. It is not a master class in citrus tree pruning, which could be a several-hour class in and of itself. It's also not a master class in all the different varieties that do well in Marin now, and with climate change could be trending in our direction. For example, grapefruit. So it's it's an introduction to citrus trees. It's not the end point. So if that's okay, I'll move on. Did that make sense to everybody before we start? Did anybody have any questions, Kay?
Nope, no questions yet.
Okay. So we're going to go through the history, growth and development, varieties, and then I'll take you through young trees, and then we'll take a break. And then we'll do mature trees, container gardening, harvesting, frost damage, and IPM. The reason I'm taking you through young trees is part of the issue you deal with mature trees is, do I need to replace this tree? And if so, how and with what? So I wanted you to have both sides of this. And these are from 2 public seminars. And some of you were so kind to sit through the prototype for this, which was a 3.5 hour, 120 slide nightmare. This class came because I would teach tomatoes and vegetables, and people would come up and say, I have a problem with my Meyer lemon. And I go, no, this is not that class. And so we ended up creating a class because people kept saying, what's wrong with my plants or my trees? So you're in the Rudiaceae family, and you can work your way down to citrus. The truth is, the entire citrus family seems to come from a single genetic source in Southeast Asia. And about 500 BCE, citron found its way through the spice trade to the Middle East. And the oldest lemon seeds so far found in Rome are from around 100 BCE to 100 CE. So citrus has been an item of international economic exchange for at least 2,500 years. And the picture on the left is of a citron, and we don't grow a lot of that here. In California, it came with the missionaries. And so the first grove is planted in 1769. First commercial grove is 1841 in LA, of course. Then Northern California, 1856. And we produce about 59% of the citrus production in the country in 2018. What's important is this picture on the right. The majority of citrus production is in the south part of the Central Valley and east of LA. We are at what has been historically seen as the northern edge of where you can easily grow citrus. That's changing with climate change. So we expect the number of varieties to increase and the size of fruit that we can grow to increase as the temperatures change, primarily inland from us, but also here along the coast. So when you think about it from a growth and development standpoint, it's a perennial, it's an evergreen, subtropical plant. It needs at least 6 hours of sunlight in February, and it requires heat to produce sugar. It can have, in some cases, single or multiple blooms a year, and it does this thing called alternate bearing, which is, it's an easy way to panic, which is you can have a heavy crop one year and the next year a light crop. And you think, oh my gosh, what have I done? Well, that's just the way the tree works. So it's very easy to get thrown off by this heavy crop, light crop. Most citrus fruit are edible 8 to 16 months after bloom, and they have like a 2 to 6 month harvest season. The fruit stores very well on the tree, but from the moment you pick the fruit, citrus ethylene starts the decay. So the ideal thing to do is either pick the fruit and give it away immediately, or can it, or pick it slowly so that you can consume as you go. The trees also have this kind of interesting thing, which is, it's called June drop. And this is where it puts out more flowers than it should, and it puts out more immature fruit than it wants. And then somewhere in May, June, July, it pushes out the immature ones that it doesn't think are good candidates. And you might think there's something wrong with the tree, and there's nothing wrong with the tree. That's just how they manage evolution and picking which fruit that they think are most viable. When you look at the root system, this is, and we'll talk about this more when we get to soil, but the majority of a citrus tree's root system is in the first 12 to 24 inches of the soil, i.e. there is no deep taproot. And in orchards, or anywhere where there's expansive soil in all directions, the drip line, the roots are out 2x beyond the drip line. So if you measured from the trunk of the tree to the drip line and it was 6 feet, the root system could be as far as 18 feet from the trunk. And it's looking for water and nutrients. Now the leaves perform two functions: photosynthesis, which is the creation of sugar from sunlight, but also photosynthate, which is it stores sugar in its leaves and then draws on them when it's creating fruit. And then lastly, flowers form after winter dormancy, and the tree is intelligent. It's editing, so it produces more flowers than it will take to fruit, so it pushes out flowers at one point, and then it will produce more immature fruit than it takes to maturity, so it pushes those out. So when you, am I going too fast, Kay?
No, not at all. No questions so far. So I
no, I've had too much coffee, so I worry.
Oh, no, you go at a great pace.
When you start a tree, in the first 3 or 4 years, you might have light production. And the reason is the tree is pushing out roots and it's building its limb structure. And then once you start to have production, then you should start, I keep a journal of when do I see flowers and when do I see fruit, and see for your tree and your garden, what is your seasonal cycle. It can begin in the spring, but when we get to the different varieties, you'll see there's variation. There's the growth flush, several a year, but spring is the most productive. And optimally, the 70 to 90 degree Fahrenheit is the best time for citrus, i.e. when it's super hot out, that's not good. And when it's below 70, that's not good. So if you think about it, prior to this week, we've had a lot of weather in the 60s and 50s, and it's cold at night. And now all of a sudden, we're going to have a week of 70 degree or better weather. That's optimal for citrus. So any questions on growth and development? I know those were general principles, but that's just an overview. Okay?
Nothing on chat yet.
Okay. So I've just picked a small subset visually, but part of this is to show people that you do have a very broad palette of color and flavor and size to choose from in Northern California. From the smallest could be kumquats and limes all the way up to grapefruit. But what's really important with citrus is to just mentally start with a blank piece of paper. A large percentage of us have bought homes where the trees were already planted. And an awful lot of the citrus trees that are planted in Marin were planted 20, 30, 40 years ago, and they were standard side orchard citrus. So when you walk around your neighborhood, the older trees are 25 to 35 feet tall. And the problem is they're too big for the property. They're too tall to harvest safely. And if they're close to the house, they're pushing up against the eaves. I see some chat has come in.
Do you want me? Okay, from Jeff, he asks, is pruning for shape acceptable during the first few years of growth, or is it better to thin branches after the tree is fully established?
There's a whole pruning section coming, so hold that thought.
Okay, and Arlene asks, considering the drip line, where is the best place to place citrus fertilizer?
We'll get into that in more depth, but since you will be lightly raking the soil surface and placing it, you want it where the water system can bring it into the ground, right? So it's, I'll get into that as well in more detail, if that's okay. But this problem, when you look at it, an awful lot of us are dealing with standard size trees in the wrong place. And you can try to prune a standard to a semi-dwarf height or dwarf, but now you're going to be in a battle with a tree that knows it's supposed to be 30 feet tall, and you're trying to keep it at 8 to 12. And having done that, suddenly you're living with water chutes like you've never seen before. Mm-hmm. So one of the fundamental problems in Marin is the tree could be a perfectly lovely tree for an orchard, but it's on a patio or it's next to the house, and it takes up too much room, and you can't pick the higher fruit at all. And you'll see them all over Marin. So I guess you all have access to this. So this is a combination of information from our handbook and from Seven Winds Orchard, which is the best one in the state for citrus trees and information. And when you look at this, what varieties do well here, you will always find people who have things beyond what's listed here. And you see blood orange and sour orange and grapefruits and mandarins, kumquats, limequats, orange quats, pomelos, citron. But what I focused on is, and it's a little hard to see, but I work backwards with people on citrus and start with, are you in a container or in the ground? Are you in a cool climate or not? And how tall a tree do you want, really? And that works you into the ones that do best in cool climates. If they need container, they almost automatically need dwarf, because you don't want to plant a really big tree in a container. It's a lot of work. And that gets you to a subset of the trees. So when you look at this, a lot of the people that you will be helping, as soon as you've identified they're in a cooler coastal climate, this is the same set of questions as you ask people about tomatoes, by the way. There's a reason. You should be in the subset of citrus that do well in cool climate. That's the biggest denominator of what to talk about. And then the second biggest is container. Even if they're in a warm climate, not everything does well in a container. So in this case, and if they like Espalier, I added that column as well. So you go from the whole universe of citrus trees that could do well here, i.e. in the ground, hot climate, tons of room, to cooler climate, to container, and now you're down to a subset. So from this universe of trees that you could talk about, cool tolerant shortens the list, cool tolerant and container even shorter. So this is sort of the first in triaging plant selection, is being really clear on how much space do you have, what type of climate are you in, and are you in a container? Does that make sense to everyone?
Yes, Glenda asks, will these lists be available for printing?
Well, can't they download this?
I'm pretty sure that we can. We'll figure that out.
Just send them the deck. I mean, it's sure. Yes, the answer is of course.
Yeah, okay.
This is a combination of our Master Gardener Handbook, the Four Winds Growers website, and then in a few trees specifically, I had to go look in Monrovia Nursery for more detail. Because unfortunately, a lot of the agricultural school information is tailored to orchards. And so the home gardener, particularly a cool climate home gardener with a container, now you're into a very specialized set of trees.
Mm-hmm. Well, Susan's also saying that we'll post this on CT and you can print from there, just from pick it out of the presentation. And we're just very impressed with this information, Joe. It's just great to have it all in one place like this. Before I get too far from Emery's question, he asked, when the tree bears year round, does one need to take off all the fruit at some point to get the tree on a consistent schedule?
Has he had children? You know, I pick a point where I basically pick all the fruit, because I'm also kind of doing a fine level of pruning and cleaning up of the trees. But actually the better person at this is Susan. Is she on?
Susan?
Yeah, I'm here.
Susan, do you ever clean all the fruit off your tree?
My neighbors do, and friends.
Yeah, and why do you do that?
People want lemons.
Right. But you don't, it's not necessary, but you can do it.
Yeah, because if it stays on too long, then they just rot.
Right.
And so people just stop by, open up the gate, and come pick.
Right. But so theoretically, if you were picking enough every week, you wouldn't need to do that. But at some point, getting all the fruit off means you're not going to have anything rotting.
Right.
The tree doesn't require it.
Right.
Did that answer the question, Kay?
Anne-Marie, you'll have to tell us, does that answer your question?
It does. I had some gardeners at one point telling me that you have to pick the fruit because otherwise the tree essentially gets confused and isn't as productive. That's why I was wondering at that, because I see some of these are ever bearing, and so.
Yeah, and so this is where, and again, Emery, people who plant standard trees, so you've got this really big tree, you really haven't thought through, what am I going to do with all this fruit? So I would argue most home gardeners should be in a dwarf or semi-dwarf size tree, one for safety, for picking, and two, unless you're planning to make marmalade, what the heck are you going to do with all this citrus? So but if you do have a lot of production and you have everbearing, I try to make sure that if I'm not cycling through it, I pick a point where I'm going to clean the tree and then let it start over. Did that answer the question?
I
Yeah,
think
so would that be kind of November, December, or?
Well, we'll get to a harvesting slide. It's coming.
Okay, got
Emery.
it. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
And Joe, David asks, does it stress the citrus tree out if you cut all your ripe fruit off at the same time?
Why don't we take the rest of the harvesting questions at the harvesting section?
Okay, okay.
Anything else about this? Was what I was trying to make you aware of is if you're looking at, if someone says, I'm thinking of planting a citrus tree, the key questions to ask are, how much space do you have? What is your climate? And is it going into a container? And once you've answered those three questions, you can narrow the field of what trees to look at. And particularly cool climate, the list shortens and the size of the fruit critically gets smaller. The likelihood of success, to be honest with you, the easiest thing to grow in Marin is a Meyer lemon.
Mm-hmm.
So it may not be the most differentiated, but it's certainly the easiest. So I just wanted people to understand when you're helping someone, these questions get you to a short list. If you're in Nevada, in the ground, and you have unlimited space, you can practically grow anything on the list. Then it's just a question of which orange or which lime. Or any other questions?
I don't think so. I think we've covered everything for now.
Okay. So here's the other thing. Some of us, and again, I use Susan because we live a block away. If you walk a couple blocks in any direction from our house, it's warmer. We are in a little cool pocket. So the other thing to be aware of is and particularly people at the bottom of hills or in low points on flat ground, how cold does it get in your neighborhood? And we have the risk of frost in Marin from October to May. Now, it doesn't happen every year, but we have had periods where we had multiple days of frost. And you just need to be sensitive to how cold is your area. Now, where this becomes more prominent is further north and frankly, in towards the mountains. Coastally, we're more moderate. So how do you select a citrus tree? The last thing you want to do is buy a tree at a nursery that has fruit on it. Don't fall in love with that. The younger the tree, the better. The smaller the container size is better. So what you're looking for is a healthy looking tree with dark green foliage and no blemishes, nicks on the bark. You want symmetrical branching, no obvious pest damage. Check the soil for pests, and when the nursery's not looking, tip the canister over to see if it's root bound. If there are roots coming out at the bottom, go to a next tree. Truthfully, an awful lot of the trees that I see in nurseries are just not very good trees. So I poke around and poke around and poke around and go to multiple nurseries before I buy a tree. You shouldn't be in a hurry to buy a tree. So before we leave this, any questions on selection?
Nothing on chat.
Okay. Now, citrus trees need well-drained soil and loosely compacted, good layers. Bear in mind, the way I look at it, I add organic material annually to the soil around my tree because these things consume nutrients. They are heavy feeders. And you do not want weeds or grasses or ornamental plants inside the drip line. So if you see citrus trees planted in the middle of a yard with the grass right to the trunk, you're going to have a significantly lower production from that tree because the grass is taking nutrients from the tree. And so if you look in orchards, they might have grass down between the rows, but under the trees they have soil, just dirt. If your soil does not perk, i.e. when it rains, the water sits on top, you need to work with the soil and improve the perk and also improve the drainage because you don't want citrus trees standing in standing water. Questions about soil?
None yet.
Okay. And if you're planting in ground in Marin County, we have appallingly bad soil. So the majority of us have to build our soil and keep building it because the ground around it is just so bad. Now, planting. Basically, it's an October to March thing because you want to get a tree in the ground without a lot of heat. You don't plant it on July 1st. It's the hardest time of year for a tree to get established. It needs full sun and heat. It needs good drainage. If you are planting in the middle of a lawn, when you're starting, remove 5 feet all the way around. And then as the tree gets bigger, just pay attention. Now, orchards have done, by the way, if you're building an orchard, and I had someone come to this class who had over 30 trees on their property. So, and they're a master gardener. Commercial groves do all kinds of things to pack trees in. Most of us don't have that issue. We have the opposite issue, which is I'm only going to put in one. How far from the house should I be? How far from the driveway should I be? What's the branching going to look like when it's mature? And this is where you need to be clear. Are you buying a dwarf or semi-dwarf or full-size tree? There are varieties that you can plant to become hedges, and they are beautiful. But that's a whole nother thing of thinking through how far apart should the trees be? How am I going to prune it? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the hedging, but you can research using citrus trees as hedges, and they're very pretty. Any questions, Kay?
Yeah. Jeff has asked, how often do we need to add fertilizer or organic matter?
It's coming.
It's coming. Do you have a specific nursery that you've preferred the quality of citrus trees to compared to other nurseries?
You know, as a master gardener, we don't endorse different places. And I personally find you should look around.
Okay, okay. Somebody mentions 4 wind growers that she thought that maybe you had mentioned that in one of your other presentations.
I did mention them, and they were mentioned back here. They're one of the resources for this. And so when you're doing your research, 4 Winds is a great site for information by type of tree. I think they're down near Los Angeles. So they may be having varieties that don't fit here as well as others.
Okay. That's it for questions so far.
Okay. So one of the classic problems with putting in a new citrus tree is they're planted too deep. So if you look at the little picture on the left, when you get a citrus tree, brush the soil away from where the stalk of the tree goes into the ground, and you'll see what's called a root flare. And it's literally the beginnings of this shallow root system branching out from the stalk of the tree. You want to make sure you haven't buried that. You actually, if I were a carpenter, I would say you want it sitting proud. So you want the root flare above the surface of the soil and bark. And because if you don't do that, then you can have rot kick in. And so the very first thing is find where that root flare is. And it's usually, no more than 1 or 2 inches below, because nurseries just throw soil in. Then what I do is I take a tape measure and measure, because now I've got the tree out of the pot that it came in. And I've looked to make sure that the roots, I've teased the roots a bit so that they're pointing out. Not, if you find a tree where they're all curling around, this was not a good buy. But I want to measure from the bottom of the root flare to the bottom of the root ball. The hole that you dig cannot be any deeper than that distance, because the tree needs to sit on solid ground. It used to be, the rule was you dug a hole twice as deep and twice as wide as the root ball. And what happened is you'd fill it with peat moss and compost, and then those things would sink. And the tree would sink, and then soil would go up against the stalk of the tree, and it would promote rot. So you're trying to get the tree to sit proud once you're in the ground. And so you want to be no deeper than the root ball and 3 times wider. And so you're in essence creating a dish. This is sort of the most fundamental part of planting a tree. Does this make sense to everybody?
I don't see any questions.
Okay. So staking. The 2 schools of thought. I've had people tell me staking is important and you need to leave them up for years. And I've had other people say you want to get past the staking point within 6 to 12 months. And I think it depends on how the tree's root system is developing and whether it feels firm in the ground. So there's some wiggle room, but after 1 to 2 years, you don't want to continue to be staking your trees if you can avoid it. There are some special cases, and I'll talk about in a minute. Make sure that the stakes are outside the root ball. I have seen people put a stake right next to the stalk of the tree, which means you're driving it through the root ball, which is crazy. Then you want rope and a softer material against the bark. And as soon as the roots are established, you want to get the staking out. The one caveat that I know about where it is important to differentiate is if you're putting a citrus tree like next to your sidewalk as a cutout in the sidewalk where car doors are being opened, in which case you may want to put 3 stakes on the curbside to protect the tree from car doors. But that's the only case where I know where in the long term you really want to leave stakes in place. Does this make sense?
Yes, Joe, one question I missed from Julie back on the root flare. She says, do you have a photo of a root flare? I'm wondering if that picture you had is a.
This is an immature tree. I do, and I don't know where I have it. You will see them if you go to orchards. You'll see that at the top, where the tree enters the ground, you'll see the tops of roots. I'm sure you've seen it on other trees as well. And you're just trying to make sure that there's a little bit of the tree sitting proud so that the root flare is going out and you've protected it. But that on the left is a young tree and you can see where the roots are just starting. So when we planted this, just like the very topmost piece of roots were proud, so you could see them. Does that make sense?
Yes. Julie, does that sound good to you?
It does. So in the photograph, is that how it's supposed to be planted?
No. This was with all the soil away so you could see the root system.
Okay. So
Yeah,
would
no.
you put soil up to just barely cover those roots that are sticking up there?
Yeah, because if you see the root system,
Mhm.
unlike trees with a big taproot, this looks more like a fine mesh of small roots going out in all directions because it's such a heavy feeder. So it's looking for water and nutrients.
Okay.
So the root flare protection is just so that, you want to keep bark and soil, away from the stalk of the tree, the trunk. And the root flare it's just, the orchardist that I talked to about it said it's a fine touch,
Mhm.
how much to expose. And his point was, when in doubt, keep your bark a couple inches away, keep your soil so that you can see where the roots are going into the ground, right where it's starting, you can see that, and you should be fine.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions, Kay?
Jeff saying, if we have mulched above the root flares level, but have left the 4 inches around the trunk clear, is that a problem? So he's saying, so the root flare is above grade, but mulch is a couple inches above that 4 inches away from the trunk.
Yeah, actually, that's a good question. If you're away from the trunk 3 or 4 inches, and your mulch then is 4 inches or 3 inches or 2 inches deep, that's fine because you're away from the trunk, right? But if and by the way, I'm forever finding, leaves and junk fall back in there. So you've got to kind of once or twice a year go through and clean out around the trunk. But his is a good question because you can then have 3 or 4 inches of mulch. You just don't want it up against the trunk.
And Debbie says, is that the same if planted in a container?
Good question. So
This is a very curious class.
no. So this is the tricky thing in containers is some people for aesthetic reasons want the bark or the mulch right up against the trunk, but you should still tease it away 2 inches or more so that there's nothing capturing water and leaving the water against the trunk. Did that make sense?
Anybody
Other-
have a question?
The root flare thing is a tricky thing. But if you walk around, you'll see some trees that are beautifully, almost architecturally going into the soil. And that's what you want. We talked about staking. Now watering. When I have a mire that I put in 2 years ago, and the drip line has moved out once already because of the branching. So when you plant the tree, your drip line, your irrigation, I put just inside the drip line, like a couple inches, because you're trying to promote the root growth out. And then as the branches grow and grow out, you keep moving the drip line out. And the idea is that you're not, first off, you're not watering at the trunk. So you're reducing the likelihood of there being any mildew and things there or rot. And two, you're promoting the root growth. But a citrus tree needs 10 gallons of water a month. And that's a lot of water. So you really need to think through your watering strategy, and when they need water the most is in the summer. So your frequency of watering, it can be, twice a month, but it needs to be 10 gallons a month. So, and then if we go into a really hot, dry summer, you may need to boost that. Or you could have, for example, people in Nevada that I've talked with and helped, they're in very hot climates with a very dry wind at the end of the day that sort of sucks the oxygen away, or the water away. So if you're in one of those places that dry out and get very dry from a very dry, hot, sunny, windy day, you may want to water more often. And you water in the early morning so that it's had a chance to perk and go into the ground before the sun gets too hot. Any questions here? This is important.
10 gallons a month year round plus more at high heat, asks Emery.
Well, if it's raining, if it's a rainy season and we're seeing a lot of rain, then you can back off. But like this winter, it didn't rain. Was it January it didn't rain, or February? We had a whole month with no rain. So I turned my irrigation back on in the middle of that because I was worried about the trees not getting enough water. But certainly in the summer, you should be looking at 10 gallons a month for citrus trees. And we'll deal with this more when we get to containers. When you're dealing with a container, that says that you're going to water more frequently, but in smaller amounts. Because if water's going out the bottom of the container, it's not helping the tree. Questions?
I guess Emery's concern is if it gets a lot hotter, would you water more than 10 gallons in the summer if you've got
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So you can get, by the way, on fertilizing trees, it's fascinating how much stuff there is out there to read. And you can do soil testing and leaf testing and all this stuff. Or you can be putting a couple inches of compost out once or twice a year, 2 inches thick, away from the trunk, out to the drip line. Or you can be using citrus fertilizer because you're trying to make sure that you have all the minor nutrients. But again, 2 to 3 inches out from the base to the drip line. The point is, these are heavy feeders. And when we get to the IPM section, there are all these different effects if they're missing the minor nutrients, iron, manganese, zinc. So I kind of overcompensate. I put compost out twice a year, and I put fertilizer, citrus fertilizer, I kind of alternate so that I make sure that the tree is heavily fed. It's the only thing I add fertilizer in my whole garden. So this is important, but you can overthink it. But the easiest way is compost and citrus fertilizer, and then you're pretty much done. Questions?
One question back on the watering from Cherise. She says, is the same true for young, newly planted trees, you know, a watering schedule? Would you give them that 10 gallons a month, year round, that kind of thing?
Yes.
Okay. And Julie asks, how many times do you fertilize?
More than I'm supposed to. I compost annually. I add 2 inches around, and then right before the new crop, when they're going to flower, I put in you know, a shot of fertilizer sort of at the beginning of spring. And the thing is, because you can also you'll talk to people who are really micromanaging. There's particularly people with a lot of trees. They manipulate this. So there are all kinds of things you can get into. I had someone, well, when I first talked to the people at Davis about this class, they told me how many tons of nitrogen per acre to apply. And I had to say, I'm only talking about individual trees in gardens. And they went, oh, all right. Well, it's 1 pound to 1.5 pounds of nitrogen per year. So you can get that detailed if you wish. But I found a combination of compost and citrus fertilizer, and I haven't had a problem. Does that make sense?
Julie, does that sound good?
Yeah, that's helpful. I heard you say that you did 2 compost twice a year, but then you said you
Julie, if I'm having anxiety, I do 2. If I'm mellow, I do 1.
okay,
Every
but
year,
then,
you know, I have years where I panic about compost and I overdo it, and I have years where I'm feeling confident.
okay,
I
but the
think my
fertilizer,
compost use is a reflection of my confidence.
but the citrus fertilizer you just added at the beginning of the spring every
Yeah.
year. Just once, okay.
And that's because, you know, this minor nutrients thing, when we get to IPM, there are all these things that are a result of missing these trace nutrients. So you go, all right, to hell with it. Just buy the fertilizer that has them all and put it out, and then I don't have to worry about that. Other questions, Kay?
I think that's, Richard's asking, what method do you use to water your plants to get to the 10 gallons? Everybody,
I
we're
use
not,
drip lines, but I've also, earlier in my life, I used soaker hoses. So it's just something where you have some idea of how much water you're putting out. You know, so then you're doing, I've got this many drips and they're putting out half a gallon an hour. And so I need, you know, to run this for how long to get to 5 gallons, and I'm going to do it twice a month, or 10 gallons, I'm going to do it once a month. Just do the math.
okay. Well, that's it for questions so far.
Okay, mulch and weeding. So it's critically important that you mulch around the tree, but keep it away from the trunk and at least 2 inches thick, because weeds are not your friend. Anything growing under a citrus is not your friend. Weeds, weeding promotes growth. So if you are weeding and there's no weeds, you'll have 30% more growth than if there are weeds and grasses and things growing underneath the citrus. And if you've kept everything away from the trunk, when pulling weeds, just be careful how you're pulling around the root ball. Because I've seen people with those digging tools to get all the root out, and they're stabbing into the root ball, and you want to be as careful as possible right close to the tree, but you've got to get the weeds out. And so to me, it's just every time I walk by my citrus trees now, plural, I'm looking and I'm pulling weeds. Any question, Kay?
Do you have a preferred type of mulch for your citrus?
No.
That's it.
So mature tree watering. You want to make sure that the tree, some people still hand water trees. I don't find it reliable. And you want to make sure that the root system doesn't dry out. So there will be years during our drought where I get very nervous about trees as I'm walking around my neighborhood, because you can see the ones where they're not getting enough water. So if you have a young tree, there's a trick called basin flooding, which is you go 3 feet out, 3 to 6 feet, 3 feet out from the trunk of the tree, and you build a little dam. And it's 3 to 6 inches deep, and you fill the dam with water, and you watch it sink. And that is a way of kind of reminding yourself how much water to put in if you're doing it, for example, from gallon buckets, and also to see that you've kind of concentrated, flooded it. Drip irrigation line is great. And the trick is just to make sure that you're putting out about 10 gallons. Other sources, and this is where you kind of have to look, do smaller amounts of water per session. And so I've found in the source materials a range of information on frequency and amount. And I would say, watch your tree carefully, because everybody's garden is different, how the soil perks is different, and how the sun and the wind work on it are different. But the key is, the younger the tree, they need water more frequently. And if it's a hot summer, you're going to be thinking every 5 to 10 days. Mature trees, because their root system is better established, they do a better job of pulling water from the ground. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Feeding. So theoretically, you're feeding a mature tree a pound of nitrogen a year. And I just go with the citrus food with all the trace elements, because you can lose your mind going through the zinc, iron, manganese, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, and boron needs. So it's easier just to buy a high quality citrus plant food and use it. So before we dive into pruning, which is its own minor nightmare, is any questions about what we've talked about so far?
Nothing on chat, but if somebody wants to ask, now's the chance.
Yes, you said one pound of that fertilizer. Is that the same for a mature tree in a container as opposed to a mature tree in the ground, which may be many times the size of a mature tree in a container?
So this is where, Emery, it becomes dodgy, because there isn't the greatest data out there for container gardening. Most of the data is around orchards and in ground. So when I look at containers, the containers actually have more problems, because you're pouring water through them that leaches out the nutrients. So I view container gardening as more of an exercise in renewal, regular renewal in smaller amounts. Whereas in ground, yeah, I can put a pound of nitrogen around a tree once a year, because I rake the 8-foot drip line, and then it's going to be raining and it works into the soil. If you're in a container, I can't drop a pound on a plant in one shot, but I might be, monthly adding some citrus fertilizer because it's going to then, if you see water going out the bottom of the pot, you should assume it's going out with nutrients. Do you know what I mean? So when you call Davis and ask them about container gardening, it's a very short discussion, because they're not paid to research it. Other
Thank you.
questions?
think that's it for now.
All right, pruning. On your left is a hairball. In the middle is a really ugly tree I found that had been very poorly pruned. And on the right, those things poking up are called water shoots. If you just walk around your neighborhood, you will see pruning nightmares everywhere you go, some of which might be in your yard. So the thing about citrus pruning is there's the pruning optimization for the orchard world, and then there's the rest of us. So there's some places where I have data only from the orchard world, and then there's some places where we can understand for our own homes. But the core principles are, for example, if you take Stephen Swain to lunch, which you should all do once a year because he's lovely, the basic thinking is that citrus actually needs less pruning than most ornamentals and fruit trees. Okay. And young trees should be topped at planting if they're too tall and spindly to promote side shoots. Removing water shoots and rootstock shoots are critical. You prune in the spring and fall, or you can prune a little bit all year long. And over pruning results in water sprouts. And sprouts and water shoots is the same thing. The problem with these principles is it's subject to interpretation. And so I've had two people pruning side by side with me, and one pruning expert doesn't agree with the other. So there is an art to this as well as the science, and then there's some degree of subjectivity. And this is not a pruning class. So I'm just going to give you top level principles. If you're really into pruning, join the pruning guild, because you can spend years learning how to prune these things. When you get a young tree, your real goal is to encourage scaffolding, which is what will be the permanent branching system. And you want to promote them moving out from a central leader. So the variation in that is, if you are in the orchard world, you might be promoting an open center for even greater fruit production, but that kind of tree is structurally weaker. They tend to split. And in an orchard, if you have 1,000 trees and one splits, you just replace it. If it's in your yard, now all of a sudden you put 10 years into a tree and you're starting over. So when you get a new tree and you put it in the first 2 to 3 years from planting, and I just pull up a chair and look at the tree. I'm trying to see, okay, given where we put it, how far are we from the fence? How far are we from the house? How is this next to the path? How much soil is around it? Now then, which branches are we trying to encourage? And you want to, the fine line is, if you over prune a citrus tree, almost before you get your tools put away, you'll see water sprouts. Because the tree is trying to push out growth, you've cut it back too much, it responds by these shoots coming out. So I used to have like big pruning, twice a year. And I've concluded I'm better off doing a little bit all the time. So you sort of pick the branches you don't want and go back to where they originate and get rid of them at the lateral or the trunk, and understand the branching you do want to promote. And I think if you want a great example of good pruning, it's in Susan's backyard, by the way. Her citrus are, I think, Espalier citrus and fruit trees. And she seems really good at this. And I have to live with my mistakes. It's worse than children because they don't leave home. But these are the core principles for starting a young tree. Now, any questions here? And we could spend hours on this, by the way.
Yeah, Joe Julie asks, are these rules true for dwarfs as well?
Yeah, any tree. Because you're still looking at a dwarf and saying, okay, it's only going to grow 8 feet tall, but where do I want the branching? You know, and some of them come from the nurseries and they look like just a stick. So you top it to promote lateral, or they've got some weird laterals that you kind of looking at and saying, how is that supposed to work? So it really is just, once the tree's in the ground, pull up a chair and look at it for a while, move around it, and sort of imagine, you know, when this thing is 6 feet, 8 feet, 12 feet tall, where do I want the branching? And then you work towards that. Other questions, Kay?
That's it so far, except Susan's got to provide pictures now of her citrus trees for everybody.
Oh yeah, no. I mean, she should be teaching this class. She's way smarter than I am. When you look in orchards, you'll see this open center approach. And the reason you do it is it promotes sunlight penetration. It's easier to harvest, but it is not a very strong structure. And it's best if you're doing it for big trees. So if you're doing an orchard, you can do open center. But I have found that most people, this is not a great idea for in a yard or in a container.
Oh, Joe, let me quickly ask before you go on. Emery asks, how do you deal with a hairball, like your picture of your hairball unpruned tree? Hard pruning back at one time or over time?
Let me get to that in just a sec, Emery. So the other thing to note is if you start to see growth coming off the rootstock, you have to cut that out immediately. Anything below the graft, and everything you're going to buy, almost everything is a graft. So you'll see the graft line. If the rootstock starts to push out growth, it's going to kill the tree above it, and you have no idea what you're getting. So prune those off. How to approach a hairball. So some of the best arborists I know for citrus come twice a year, and they just do small cuts at first. They're just picking away the dead wood, the not particularly attractive branches that cross, but they kind of do 2 to 4 times a year light thinning, and I mean 10 to 15 to 20%, but no more. You'd hear a rule of thumb, you could prune a tree 30% a year and it would be fine. Not citrus. So you're better off periodic pruning, small touch shaping over time, rather than I'm going out to prune, I'm going to be out all day, and when I'm done, there's going to be a mountain of stuff, and the tree's going to be 1/3 the size it was this morning. And this is where patience and kind of coming back and watching how the tree responds to the pruning and getting a feel for it is the best way to approach it. And when you are doing this kind of thinning, light pruning, don't leave stubs. Cut back to the branch or lateral. Don't open the tree too much because you can get sunburn. So you really understand the shape of the canopy that you want to maintain, and then work inside to remove excess branching that you don't need. But do it in smaller tranches. I once pruned a Eureka lemon that had been planted in the 70s by 30%, and within less than a month, I had 6-foot tall water sprouts, just everywhere, back up to the original height. So that's how I learned the hard way that these trees do not like a hard pruning.
So a couple questions. Pat asks, kind of on that subject, are the root shoots originating from the base of the trunk? Are they non-productive? Should they be removed? You've answered some of that, but...
Yeah, so it's the rootstock. If you look where the graft mark is on the stalk, any branching below the graft mark, cut and get rid of. because if the rootstock takes off on you, it'll kill the tree.
Okay, next question from Diane. Have you ever moved a Meyer lemon tree and had it go into shock? Any suggestions for recovery?
Yes. Yes. So I've moved lemon tree, and I've moved a fig tree, and so if you start out twice the width of the the drip line, and you start turning the soil and looking for roots, you'll start to find the edge of the tree, and you go underneath that. And it takes a bunch of people to do this, but you can basically feel your way and loosen up the soil and expose the roots of the whole tree. But you've got to get underneath. It's like 2 to 3 feet down, 6 to 8 feet or longer out, and you can find the whole tree. I did it with 4 guys, I guess, 3 guys. We were at it for hours. Then you've got to get burlap and get it under the tree, under the root system, and put as much of the soil in the bag as you can. And then you got to lift it as carefully as you can. If, in my case, I was moving. So I was taking 2 trees with me. So into the back of a pickup, and as carefully as possible, drive as slowly as possible to wherever you're going. And then we had dug equivalent space and put the tree in. And frankly, the trees have done better here than where they were. But they will go into shock because you've moved them. So I fed them and watered them. And within a year, they were very productive. Did that answer her question, Kay?
Does that sound good, Diane? Anything else? And if you want, I guess Diane's happy with that. Then she says,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah, Diane, it's just when moving one of these things, you have to kind of start wide and find the edge of the root system and go under. And you're kind of like slowly working your way so you can get the tree up, slip burlap under, lift the whole thing, move it. And then wherever you're landing it,
Thank
you
you.
don't want the dish to be deeper than the depth of that root structure, but you better have the width down because you don't want to be compressing the root system. And then in my case, I'd taken a pick and loosened the soil out around that so that then when the plant went in, it had good soil in all directions. Susan, did you have a question?
No.
All right, because you probably moved more trees than I have.
One more question from Nori, Joe. Can I remove water sprouts while the tree is in bloom?
Hell yes. Hell yes. But it tells you if it's the shoots coming off the rootstock, you can remove them the moment you see them. If you're seeing water shoots in the tree, it's because it's been too heavily pruned. And so you're starting an arms war with the tree. And the tree might win. So the interesting thing is water shoots will produce fruit. It's not that they're bad, it's just that they're where you didn't want the tree to grow. So I actually, with a friend, we decided to we started to shape the water shoots to the size of where we wanted the tree to end up. And over time, they became part of the branching system. It's just a decision you have to make about what you want the final tree to look like.
Joe, I have a question. How long does it take a tree to die if you didn't know that you had to remove the rootstock shoots?
It takes a while, but basically what happens is the rootstock deprives the rest of the tree of nutrients. It starts to think it's the tree.
Okay. I think
Um,
that's it for questions right now, unless somebody has something and they want to unmute and ask.
When do you take out a tree? Old
Uh,
tree.
it's
What age?
coming. Emery, I've got a whole slide. I'll show you shortly.
Okay, thank you.
So when you think about timing, once you're past the danger of frost, and before you see the new growth cycle, and by the way, I missed this spring because of the shelter in place, and I fell out off of a porch. So I've seen pruning instruction to do it in the spring before the growth spurt, or in the fall. I would research the variety and kind of look to see when you want to be in the tree. And if you're doing the sort of light pruning, you're not going to be doing this timing. You'll be at it more often, which is how I've ended up being personally. So it's 10:15. I thought we'd take a break, Kay, before we go into containers and everything else. Is that all right?
So what, 10-minute break, everybody? So that would be, let's be back at 10:25.
All right, perfect. All right,
Thank you, Joe.
all right. See you then.
Okay.
Should we dive back in, Kay?
Yes, I think we're ready.
Joe, shoots. How much of a water shoot would you take off?
Well, that was the question. If you flip back to one of the earlier pictures, this tree on the right, can you see it?
Yeah, that's the one.
So my friend had been trying to keep the tree really low, and we finally concluded that that wasn't going to work. So he had been trimming the water shoots all the way at the stalk, and they would just come popping back up.
Right, yeah.
So we finally concluded that perhaps this tree wanted to be closer to 8 feet tall rather than 4 to 6 feet, which is what he was trying to do. And so we then trimmed those water shoots at the edges to top them, and the tree filled in. It did just fine. But you can also see where water shoots, like on this picture in the middle, they're like a dozen within a foot of each other. So then you're sort of saying, what's the one I want to retain? Let's get rid of the others. And then you're creating something for the tree to then push the growth, because this tree had been so heavily pruned that the tree itself said, wait, there was a half a tree over there. What the,
So if you clip the tops off of the water shoots, then the tree will fill in.
Yeah, because it's branching.
Okay.
But then you're back to which ones do I want to promote? What's the structure that I want to have?
Okay. Thank you.
But then if you step all the way back, if you're trying to have a standard size tree in a dwarf setting, you're trying to go from 30 feet to 12, it won't work. It's a 30-foot tall, you'll be pruning all the time. At which point, then a different tree perhaps.
Okay. So it's okay to leave them and let the tree fill into the top of the shoots.
If that's what you want.
Yeah. Okay.
Citrus container gardening. So my relatives on my wife's side of the family in Italy have citrus trees that have been in pots for as long as anyone can remember. And you'll see these when you're in Europe, Southern Europe. You'll see these beautiful trees that have been in big clay pots forever. So you can do this. It's doable. The bigger the pot, the better. You want a wide mouth pot, not narrower, because every now and then you're going to tip this over and change the soil and prune the roots. You want to make sure there's sufficient drain holes. You do not want it sitting in a dish, because you don't want the vector control people coming out to spray your dishes, and you don't want them sitting in, the tree doesn't want to have wet feet. And so citrus do well in containers. That's not the issue. The issue is pick the right variety. So you want to be picking a dwarf or semi-dwarf tree to go into a container. And personally, I'm pretty comfortable when nurseries say it's a dwarf tree. I'm not 100% confident that a semi-dwarf is not a standard. So I tend to either go for full dwarf because that's still going to be in the 8 to 12 feet high versus going with a standard tree, which could be as high as 30 feet. So you have this list of what does well in containers. You still need 8 or more hours of direct sunlight per day, which is, so one way to look at your property is to say, what's the sunniest place in the whole yard? It might be next to your front door. In which case, if you have room, you can put a container citrus there. But bear in mind, how high does the tree have to grow so that you can walk past it? How much room do you actually have? You are going to need to be able to provide year-round watering. I know people who hand water container trees. That's fine, but it means you've got to be paying attention. I water the soil, not the tree or the top of the root ball. I've seen people where they've eroded the soil away from the tree, literally by overwatering right on the tree itself. You don't want the pot, as I said, sitting in water. I use outdoor potting mix for my soil. And about every 4 or 5 years, there's a point in time where you lay the tree on its side, slide it out of the container, brush the soil away and look at the roots and try and trim the root ball back, looking for older roots or diseased roots or anybody that doesn't look healthy, and then put in new container soil and basically repot the plant. And it's a project because you're wrestling around with a tree. But if you do that, you should be able to have a tree in a container for a very long time. There are other people who just benign neglect. They just never did any of that. And I think that also works, but you won't get the productivity that you could out of that tree in that container. There are a bunch of slow release fertilizers you can use if you wish, or you can use the fertilizer you're using elsewhere, citrus fertilizer you're using elsewhere, but lightly rake the top of the soil, put it in, water, and you should be fine. The problem with staking with containers is the stake is in the container, the tree is tied to the stake, and as the tree gets bigger, you want to get rid of the stakes because if it's windy, the tree already has a tendency, unless the center of gravity is fairly low, the bigger the tree in a container, the more the possibility in a big windstorm it will blow over. So you just have to pay attention to that and be careful. Does that make sense?
Yes, there's one question. Joe Debbie asks, how tolerant are they to wind? Debbie, I assume you mean citrus trees in containers.
This is where you can, I'm amazed at different places in the county. I've looked at citrus trees in containers in West Marin, up in Novato and San Rafael, Mill Valley, Tiburon, Belvedere, Corte Madera, Larkspur. Trees, container trees that are against houses in cooler climates have some advantages, one of which is the house or the wall reflects heat and sunlight, but also gives it a buffer against wind. So I haven't seen anybody lose a tree because of wind, but I worry about that. Did that answer her question, Kay?
Debbie, does that answer your question? You okay with that? I'm assuming she's fine. And Emery says something, yes, thanks, says Debbie. Emery says something in deer protection for young trees. Did you need to know something about that, Emery? Or ask Joe?
No, I've just had lime trees cut back to a stub by deer, young lime trees.
I'm coming up on critter control. Hang on, Emery, I'm coming for you. So harvesting, you have this by type of variety, and harvest windows can move. This is for everything that's not year round. And your tree in any given season could shift a bit. So you just have to be paying attention. But this speaks, someone asked about wrong tree, wrong place. The tree on my left was at a friend's house a block from me, Tony Catoni, who's also a master gardener. And she had done everything to try and keep this Meyer lemon going. And she, when she called me, because I don't know why she called me, but she called, and I said, well, how old is the tree? And she said, well, it was old when we bought the house 35 years ago. So it could be 50, 60, 70 years old, this tree. And we pruned back the dead wood, we added compost, we watered, we put in citrus food, and the productivity kept going down year to year. And when we finally decided, okay, we're just going to take this tree out, when we cut it at the base, there was only about 3/4 to an inch of wood all the way around. The center core had rotted out. The tree was dying from old age. And so we had given it a good effort, but it was just old. And it was dying back as it aged. The tree on my right is an example of a standard size. I think this is an orange tree, one of my neighbors, which is coming up underneath the eaves of the roof of the house. It's a 30-foot tall tree planted, I think it's hard to see, but it's only about 4 feet from the house. So literally it's shoving against this house. So and then I've also had people say to me, I'm having trouble with my citrus tree. And I said, what's the problem? I said, they'll say, I don't like the fruit.
Jeez.
And you ask them, how long have you had this problem? Well, I've been in the house 10 years. You go, well, I know you don't want to replace trees unless you have to, but if you don't like the fruit, or the tree is not productive, or the tree is too close to the house, or the tree is dying because it's old, perhaps you should consider replacing it. And then you could start over with a variety that you like, that you enjoy eating the fruit, that's a dwarf-sized tree that fits the property and that won't tear the roof off the house. And it's amazing how many tree questions you will get as master gardeners that when you really get down to it, it's the wrong tree in the wrong place. So it's always good to ask a bunch of questions when someone talks to you about citrus trees to get to what is the real problem we're talking about. Does this make sense to people?
There's one question Julie asks. I always have a question about removing trees. Should you remove the stump as well or plant next to it?
Here's a trick. So if you're in the wrong tree, wrong place, and it's a variety you do not eat, a size that's too large, it's too old, or the rootstock's taken over, or the place has inadequate sun, space, or drainage, it's too close to the house and roof, it's too cold for this variety. The solution is remove the tree, and it's hard, but I try to get as much of the stump out as I can and pick a variety you like. Now, a trick to this is, so many people, there's only one place to put a tree. The yard is small, it's the best sunlight, whatever. So if you're taking out one citrus tree, what you might want to do as an interim strategy is, I've done this in a couple of places, put a container for 3 to 5 years. So the tree that's going to end up there permanently, while the old root system breaks down and goes away, you're letting the soil rest, and you have a container up on top. And I usually get like a small paver to put it on so it's not sitting on the soil. And so you have the tree that you want to eventually have in that location in a container on top of a paver where it's going to go. And this does a couple of things. One, it lets the tree acclimatize to that location. Two, it lets the soil rest for a couple of years before putting in a new tree. And three, it lets you kind of get a feel for, do I want a tree, this tree in this location, and how will it do? Does that make sense? Because the idea of just pulling out a citrus and putting another one, bang, right back in, if there are diseases in the ground or problems, you're just feeding the problem. Questions?
None on chat.
Okay. You'll see orchards that have done sunburn protection, and I don't see this done a lot in residential. But if you're seeing sunburn, you can wrap newly planted trees with newspapers, or you can paint the stalks with non-enamel latex paint, 1-to-1 paint to water. And all you're trying to do is protect the bark till the canopy gets bigger. Frost protection is a profound issue. And if you have a standard sized tree, there's a woman who came to a couple of our classes who has a really large tree on Sir Francis Drake. And she said, how do I protect it from frost? And it's a 30-foot tall tree. And you go, you can't, unless you can figure out how to get covering over above that. So one of the reasons to go with dwarf or semi-dwarf trees is you can cover them. So if you know the temperatures are falling below 30 degrees, then you're going to want to get some kind of cover on it. And there's a range of professional products or others, but what you're trying to do is not have the water freezing on the leaves and fruit. If it turns out that you were gone or whatever, and you did have a frost, get the frozen fruit off the tree right away. Do not prune immediately, because you can exacerbate the problem. So you might have to wait a couple months to see the full extent of the frost damage and then prune. But there are people you see who are out cleaning up their trees right after a frost, and actually they either are cutting away stuff that they wouldn't have had to otherwise, or the frost damage is exacerbated. So it's get rid of the frozen fruit, watch to see how the extent of the damage, and give it a couple months and then go in and do pruning.
Joe Jeff asks, can spraying with water to allow a sheet of ice to form as insulation be an option for large trees?
I don't know. I don't know. I would look that up, and I would think, check what the orchardists do. I don't know.
Okay, that's it for questions so far.
Okay. Okay, pest management. So, as I said earlier, this is one of the areas that goes infinitely with citrus trees. So, let's start with critters. Depending upon the year and how hungry they are, deer and other critters will swarm trees. Because there might be a year where this is the only food out there. So go to IPM, go to the type of tree, and look up either what the problem is you're looking at to figure out what's attacking your tree. Ultimately, you're going to end up in some combination of protecting the tree and trapping. So, for example, we were having trouble with something was literally eating the rind, the skin off of our lemons. So we bought what we called a full burqa, which is this green fabric orchard product with a Velcro opening. And it goes over the top of a 12 or 16 foot tall tree. So you need to use poles to get it over. And then it cinches at the bottom. You literally has a bungee cord that cinches it to the trunk of the tree. And then the only way you can get in is through this Velcro opening. And if you're having rat or squirrel problems, that kept them off the trees and away from the fruit. And if you're clever, like our second here, you're putting poles so that the whole thing is not resting on the tree at all, so they can't push against it to try and get at the fruit. So it's like you created a tent for your tree. And you just got to keep an eye on it, because we did find at the end of the season, some rats had actually chewed through that to get in, but they didn't do that much. They did way less damage than in previous years. Does that make sense?
Yes, Joe, what was that called? Glenda wants to know what was that?
I knew you'd ask, and I can't think of the name of the product, and I shouldn't endorse them anyway, but you can go online to the Better Garden Supply companies and find these whole tree covers for rat and squirrel protection.
Okay.
And they let the sunlight through, they don't affect growth. It's great. If you're having deer trouble, you need to fence or put a wire mesh around the plant till it gets established enough. The thing with deer is they're looking for nitrogen. So a very young tree putting out a lot of new growth is just a nitrogen buffet. So I think it was Emery asked the question. For the longest time, when I would start a new tree, put deer fencing around it just in case the deer got over my other fencing and got into the yard, they wouldn't hoover my new fig and lemon tree. Did that answer Emery's question?
Emery?
Yes, I had the same experience.
Yeah, it's just, there's no other way to do it. So, fruit and flower, possible problems and causes. You may have a season where there are few or no flowers. And that could be because you pruned it too much the previous year, it's too young, or you're having one of these alternating big growth years, smaller growth years. If you're seeing fruit drop, some of that's normal, but you may have a year with a lack of pollination. If you're seeing small fruit, check to make sure there are no rootstock suckers. Overplanting, meaning the trees are too close to each other, or you've planted other things underneath the tree, or the tree is getting old. Lack of flavor. Dirty secret, by the way, the main reason to have your own citrus is the flavor's a lot better. The professional citrus industry, 2 to 3 weeks before they harvest, they flood their fields. And the reason they do that is the trees absorb all this water and their fruit gets bigger, heavier. And since they're paid by the ton, they're flooding it for a reason. So if you're worried about lack of flavor, it could be you're watering too much. Split fruit could be water irrigation problems, pot binding if you're in containers. It could be a problem with the variety you selected. It could be nutrient deficiency. So you need to look up for your fruit, that variety, look up split fruit and see what causes it in that variety.
Oh, Joe, one question from Jeff. Are citrus self-compatible, or are there some varieties that require cross-pollination from another tree, either same or different variety?
That's a damn good question. I don't know the answer. I don't know. I'll have to look that up. Does anybody have their handbook with them?
Mine's pretty
It's
far.
interesting. I was wondering why I hadn't covered pollination, and I don't think it's in the handbook.
Well, if it's not in there, it sounds like that might be the answer, right? It's not something to worry about, maybe.
Well, yeah. No, it's not in here. I'm just looking. Well, that guarantees you it won't be on the test. I don't know the answer. I should look that up. I will, but I don't have it with me today. Other questions?
Yeah, do you, I have this thing jumps around. Do you fruit thin or bud thin on citrus?
I don't do either because the tree does it. You'll see the tree, it'll have more buds than it needs and they'll fall off. And then it'll start more fruit than it needs and it'll push off some. And some years there's more than others. So the tree is kind of an interesting self-editing system.
That's great. Linda says she believes a few citrus require cross-pollination, clementines, for example.
Yeah, I think we'd have to look it up. I don't know.
And another question from Arlene, how is the rootstock chosen for citrus trees?
There's a whole section in the book on rootstock selection, which I found breathtakingly boring. And there are pages of it. And I think they want you to know because maybe you want to do your own grafting. I don't know. But they give you way more information than I think you could use. But it's here. If you want to learn more about rootstocks, it's certainly in here. I didn't cover it. Because the rootstock, I actually never selected a citrus tree on the basis of the rootstock.
Okay, that's it for questions so far, Joe.
Okay. So it seems like every year there's something. And I can't tell you why. The tree looks a little yellow. There's some mottling. There's some old leaves dropping. And so these pages kind of show you that and by the way, if you go into IPM, it just keeps fanning out and fanning out. There's some very fine detail connection between the regular major elements of the nutrients and the trace elements and the tree. And the trees can be forgiving some years and not others. So a lot of my experience is if you've established regular fertilizing and you're not overwatering and you're careful, most of the time you don't have to tweak things. There may be, and a couple times I've brought leaves into the help desk to get Stephen Swain to look at them to say, what's wrong here? But most of the time, if you're managing your fertilizing and compost and watering, you should be okay. But if you see yellowing leaves or mottling or older, again, yellow and drop, there are things you can tweak. But I would start with make sure that you have a foundation of fertilizing and compost that's in regular batching. And then most of these don't happen that often. And most of the time it won't kill the tree. You might be having a bad year, but if it's affecting the tree significantly, bring a sample in to the office because it gets into a level of detail that my brain explodes. On the other hand, How many of you are manure people? Can I see a show of hands? Okay, what are you getting? How many of them?
We don't have, I think we have to figure out how to do raise our hands.
Oh, never mind. It was a
Yeah.
joke. So
There's a function that allows you to do that, but I'm sorry, I don't know how to do it yet, so.
my bet is somewhere between 20 and 30% of the people use different varieties of manure. And that's been my experience teaching classes. Use it sparingly because they're high in salt and you can burn trees. And use it right before you're going to either have a rain or you're going to have a heavy watering, because you want to use that to leach the salt away. But you can actually see after applying manure, the foliage turned yellow because you're a little bit of shock going on. So if you are going to use manures and you're going to rough the soil up and put it out to the edge of with your compost out to the edge of the drip line, then make sure that you water. And the manure that's not well composted will release ammonia, which can hurt the roots. So you have to make sure that if you are using manure, it's been well composted. But there are people who love to use manure. Any questions, Kay?
Yes, Glenda says, I use my backyard chicken manure, but it is composted first and I add rabbit manure directly. No problems.
There you go. See, our manure people. It's not everybody, but it's a solid 20-25% of the master gardener world. So citrus and water stress. Do you see these leaves curling? If we get to July, August, September, and it hasn't been raining and it's hot, the tree is stressing. So you can wet the soil, deep watering, and increase the frequency of that, and you'll see this calm down a bit. I am worried about this summer because we are, I think, a third lower water than normal. And even though the reservoirs are fine, I'm worried about the groundwater. So pay particular attention if we continue to stay in a drought and you get high heat. Watch for water stressing, heat stress on your trees. Does that make sense? I'll take that as a yes.
Yes, I think so. I don't see anybody questioning.
Okay, so this is Stephen Swain's triad. You should be watching for Asian citrusillid and Amaralia. Things you can address is botrytis and scale, and things that won't kill your tree but that are irritating are citrus bud mite, leaf miner, and leaf rollers. So the reason I bring this up is there are things that are dangerous to trees that are really problematic, and then there's things that are irritating but not deadly. So we have had one instance of Asian citrusillid in Marin County, and that was a couple of years ago. And the problem is that this comes with this disease on the actual psyllid. And it's a very serious threat to citrus trees worldwide. So if you see these effects, call the hotline because you need an expert out right away. It's more prevalent in Southern California, Florida than here, but we've had an instance. Espalier is poor growth or dieback of shoots, small yellowing leaves, premature leaf drop. And it's because where you planted a tree had oak trees previously, and the root systems, as they broke down, have this fungus in them. And so, unfortunately, if you have this problem, it is very difficult to save a tree. You can call the office, bring in the samples, but if they diagnose it as this kind of root rot, you're going to have to do something else. Perhaps plant a container tree in the same location. Now, botrytis, you'll see dead buds and twig and branch gummosis and this scarring, weird-looking scarring of the fruit. It's a fungal pathogen. Hey, Emery, you need to mute. You have too many birds. It's a fungal pathogen, and it comes in the cool, wet conditions of spring. And frankly, once the season dries out, it will go away. But get off the dead branches and remove the damaged fruit so it doesn't spread. Scale. Personally, I have never seen this on my citrus trees, but people have bad scale years. And so I would look up on IPM for your variety how to address the scale. You can use horticultural ants or oil. You can, I don't know how you control with ants per se, but research it, because I have had people tell me of significant scale problems.
There's one question from Jeff. He says, if I suspect HLB in a tree I haven't planted yet, but haven't observed psyllid signs, is there anything to do other than wait and see? Stephen Swain recommended planting out the tree and caring for it because the HLB symptoms can resemble nutrition deficiency.
Yeah, I would go with what Stephen said. He's way smarter than me.
Debbie says, Debbie was asking the same question. So that's it so far.
Okay. So citrus bud mite, this I see all the time. You see it everywhere. It's fruit that kind of looks vaguely like your relatives, the old people. You know, it's kind of weird looking faces and puffy cheeks and nose problem. That's my family. I don't know about yours, but it's because there's a bud mite that's almost impossible to see, which is in the fruit. So if you see this, get the fruit off the tree and out of the yard. And there are sprays you can use for it. Research it online through IPM. But this, I see this almost every year on different trees and on mine. And if you immediately pick the fruit, it's a good step forward towards trying to keep this under control. I'm not big on spraying, so I try to avoid it as much as possible, but I do keep on top of getting this fruit off of the tree and out of the yard. So that was sort of, that was the class. I just realized.
That was perfect. You know, we said till 11 and it's just a tiny bit over, and we've been answering questions. So it was fantastic.
So just closing thoughts. By the way, this picture on our left, I had a bougainvillea that was tearing apart the side of the house. So as I was taking it out, I found this orange tree in the bougainvillea. So I pulled out the bougainvillea and I left that. It turns out it is a Washington navel orange, obviously a volunteer. And it now gives us a couple dozen Washington navel oranges this season. It's a beautiful little tree. This is a way of saying, try a couple different things, not just the Meyer lemon, but stay in the dwarf size so you can manage it. And pick fruit that you like to eat, but not in a tree so large that it gets ahead of you and you can't manage it. And The thing about citrus trees is you're really planting something for, you know, if we were living in Cyprus, you say you plant an olive tree for your grandchildren. I think of it as you're really planting citrus trees for the person you're going to sell your house to in 20 or 30 years. So just bear that in mind. Space sufficiently away from houses and fences. Be careful about where you're going to walk. Make sure you can keep the soil clear below. Tiny pruning done repeatedly is better than big pruning projects once a year. And stay on top of mulching and fertilizing and composting, and keep everything away from the trunk of the tree. And, you know, one of the benefits of climate change is we should have more types of citrus that will grow well in Marin over the next 20 years.
Oh, Joe, you thought you were done. Glenda asks, can you address powdery mildew on citrus trunks?
Copper sulfate. I have powdery mildew seems to follow me around. I don't know why. I get it on zucchini. I get it everywhere. So I just spray on copper sulfate spray. But don't let it get away from you because it'll jump all over your garden.
Yikes. Julie asks, so was your orange tree grown from a wandering seed?
That's what we think, because it was in the bougainvillea, which had just about choked it to death. And when I finally got all of that out of the way, this beautiful little tree was right there. It was sort of like, you couldn't have, I had no idea we had an orange tree. Other questions?
I think that's it on chat. Does anybody have any more questions for Joe before we break for lunch?
One of my friends, hi. One of my friends has a lemon tree that I get lemons from, and it has like sort of a black sooty stuff on the lemon tree. Is that just the way lemon trees are? It's a Eureka lemon.
No. I would go through Eureka lemon on IPM and look for black soot. Because that may be an indication of something else that's living on the tree, or it could be a problem with the tree. And this, Ellen, I'm glad you bring this up. Quite often, you'll be dealing with more than one problem on a citrus tree. An example is I had ants all over one of mine, so I put tanglefoot. And as soon as we got rid of the ants, we suddenly saw that they had been in the tree because they were feeding on something else that suddenly took off on me. So you really use IPM and try and see what is everything that's going on with this tree. But I would check black sooty stuff on IPM.
Joe, Julie goes back, you know, on her wandering seed. Does that mean it's not true to type since it wasn't grafted?
I don't look a gift
Orange.
navel orange in the, I mean, so far so good. I mean, it's a healthy, you can see the leaves, they're gorgeous. It's a healthy little tree that just was trapped in this bougainvillea. So there's so few gifts in life, you shouldn't question them. Just take them and keep moving.
Well, along the same line, Jeff asks, can you grow new trees from seed? Any concerns about them being, quote, own rooted, end quote?
Well, it's interesting. Some of the newer Meyer lemons coming on the market aren't grafted. So that's interesting to me. Most of the citrus you see are done with grafts. I don't know the answer to doing it from seed yourself, other than you have to be really patient then.
Okay. Well, I think that's the last question. Oh,
I'm sorry, I had one more question. Joe, in your neighbor's tree, you said that, or you showed a picture of the tree that you finally ended up cutting out with her. And that had a lot of kind of a white, growth bark, which looks exactly like my old lemon trees. And is that a problem? It's certainly an age, it seems to me to be a kind of common with older lemon trees, at least on my property.
How old is your house?
1891.
Well, you know, the good news is it's younger than us. I mean, older than us. But I mean, Emery, these lemon trees, I don't have a good sense of how long they live because the orchard data, you know, people in Europe have had lemon trees in some orchards for over 100 years. I don't know the good answer here. But when you start to see this, the branching gets this moss on it, and the tree is producing fewer leaves and less fruit. We tried to save it, but we eventually figured out this was just really old. And when we did finally cut it down, the core of it was rotted out. It was hollow. It was literally an inch around the edges. So it was just dying of old age. And we now have...
So the moss is
not
is
opportunistic.
issue per se.
Yeah, the moss isn't what's killing it. The tree is old. How many old trees do you have?
Okay. Well, a number. I've got some 20-foot orange trees and some 12-foot lemon trees.
Yeah, I mean, you might want to start kind of thinking about over time replacing the ones that are not doing the best and getting them down in height, and you know, you don't want to do it all in one shot, but
okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Well, Shauna says something interesting. She said some citrus, back to one of our earlier questions, some citrus are self-fertilizing and will breed true. Some citrus develop by parthenogenesis and will breed true. Did I say that correctly, Shauna?
All right, we should have Shauna teach that part. I don't know.
Yeah.
So Kay, I want to thank your class. You're the pandemic class. I was thinking about this today. You know, poor Susan and Kay, you know, they they sign up to run this class.
That's
and, you know, we've had classes in drought years, flood years, pest years, sudden oak death, recession, elections, which is possibly the worst year. And this year, oh boy, global pandemic, can't meet in class. I'm so proud of you guys for getting through this, and for Kay and Susan for keeping the load on the wagon and getting through it. So thank you from the Master Gardeners.
Well, thank you. My goodness, what would we do without you, Joe, and some of the other people who were willing to Zoom in and keep things going for us? You know,
well, anything to help you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe. We really, really appreciate it. And I'm starting some seeds, so let me know what you need.
All right. Well, we'll
Thank
see
you, Joe.
And have a great summer.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks for everything.